Welcome to Late Edition Crime Beat Chronicles, a Lee Enterprises podcast. I'm your host, Nat Cardona. We introduce you to the Lincoln Journal-Star's published Presumed Guilty series, an award-winning examination of the case from 2009, which later in 2019, the project was adapted for a podcast revisiting the case, hosted by Elizabeth Rembert. This is part 2 of an abridged re-release of the Presumed Guilty podcast. You'll need to go back and listen to part 1 if you haven't already. We left off with 6 people behind bars for the 1985 murder and rape of Helen Wilson. 6 innocent people set to serve a combined 70 years behind bars. Now, prepare yourself for how things played out in the courtroom. 4 of those 6 defendants turn on each other with their testimonies setting up one defendant to serve life.
We have Lobo, or Joseph White, an Alabama native who served time in the Army. The days after his discharge were filled with sex, booze, and hustling. He came to Beatrice in late 1984 and left for Alabama in March 1985. Lisa Brown, a 17-year-old Beatrice girl and Bert's confidential informant number 1, raised Lobo as a suspect in her statement. He would always maintain his innocence. Next is Joanne Taylor, who hailed from North Carolina and came to Beatrice with Joe to see her daughter. She is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and was violent in the Beatrice party scene. In her statement, Lisa Brown said Joanne bragged to her about committing the murder. With help from Bert and Beatrice Police Sergeant Sam Stevens, Joanne said she was there when Joe and another boy stabbed Helen Wilson. Joe and Joanne often stayed with Tom Winslow, who became a suspect when he told Bert he was in Helen Wilson's apartment with the two the night of the murder. He said he and his girlfriend left when Lobo and Joanne forced the widow into a room and they heard her screams. Later, he said he'd lied in that statement. He was not there when Helen died, but he maintained that Lobo and Joanne were there. Deb Sheldon was Helen Wilson's great-niece and became a suspect when her husband implicated her in a conversation with Bert. She said she visited her great-aunt's apartment with Tom, Joe, and Joanne. She remembered hearing her aunt scream, and she said she got hurt during the attack and her head was bleeding. James Dean was a 25-year-old construction worker when he emerged as a suspect during the same conversation with Deb Sheldon's husband. He told Bert he knew the other suspects but was not in Helen's apartment the night she died. He defended himself for 2 weeks, but began to have doubts after he failed a polygraph test. Dr. Wayne Price, a Beatrice psychologist who also worked as a part-time deputy, said James was likely repressing the memory of witnessing Helen's death. Finally, Kathy Gonzalez became a suspect in a conversation with Deb Sheldon. She had lived in the apartment above Helen Wilson's, and she told authorities she knew nothing, but agreed to return to Gage County. She continued to deny involvement, but was frustrated by her inability to remember what others said she did. This was where the Beatrice Six stood when they came before Richard Smith, the Gage County attorney. Richard was the county's top lawman, and he made sure police and deputies knew that. Some said he ruled with an iron hand and called him King Richard. He rebuffed his critics, saying his tough convictions made up for any ferocity. And the 6 convictions he got in the Helen Wilson murder case were the biggest of his career. Decades later, DNA testing would make them even bigger. The exonerations were not something Richard could have imagined when he joined the county attorney's office in 1978, and then became the attorney in 1980. Voters would keep him in office for 27 years. Over those years, he rarely took cases to trial. He preferred plea agreements. They were efficient, they helped save the county money, and they helped with overburdened courts. So, with 6 defendants in the Helen Wilson case, he immediately started negotiating with their court-appointed lawyers. He'd say he was, quote, trying to show a distinction between the ones who did the crime and the idiots along for the ride. But aside from the type B blood possibly matching one defendant, the case had almost no physical evidence to put the suspects in the victim's apartment. Richard would need some of these so-called idiots to be witnesses to turn on each other. Remember how hard the 1985 investigation worked to find forensic evidence at the scene? They tested dozens of people for their blood type and threw out suspects that didn't match the type B non-secretor blood type. They'd even tested Joe White back in the early stages, but let him go once his Army card showed he had O-positive blood. This new investigation lacked that kind of scrutiny. Burt had built his case on word of mouth. Later, he'd even admit he'd paid little attention to forensics. So Richard prepared to prosecute on eyewitness testimony from some of the participants. And he had a sledgehammer to collect those testimonies. The threat of the death penalty. Like all county attorneys, he knew the possibility of being executed motivated cooperation. Of the 6 defendants in Helen's murder, Joe seems the least likely to fold. He'd admitted nothing since his arrest in Alabama. He said he believed his innocence would emerge, and he put his faith into the system, as Judge William Rist denied almost every significant motion made on his behalf. The judge set his trial date for October 30th, 1985, as his co-defendants lined up to testify against him. His old friend Joanne Taylor had incriminated herself in the first 3 statements to authorities, but she stopped cooperating after she got a lawyer. Her attorney filed motions that showed Joanne would fight. A motion to suppress her confession was her best bet. If the judge found Joanne had been improperly questioned, the prosecution's case against her could crumble. And since she'd implicated at least 2 of the other suspects, those cases would be at stake as well. Her lawyer argued Joanne made her statements involuntarily because she didn't know she was under arrest for first-degree murder. He added that officers coerced her by improperly promising her they would protect her and her young daughter from retribution by her co-defendants. Even Richard didn't like how Burt and Sam had interrogated Joanne. They'd mentioned too many details about the crime and had tried to get her to change her account to fit the facts. There were also the interruptions in the tape, where she changed her story after a gap. Despite the red flags, Richard didn't think the 2 investigators had broken the law. In court, he produced multiple forms with Joanne's signature, showing she'd been advised of her rights, waived them, and had not been threatened into talking. Judge Rist made his ruling on August 3, 1989. Joanne's statements would be allowed in court. On September 1st, she pled guilty. Her deal with the prosecution convicted her of second-degree murder and kept her from becoming the first woman on Nebraska's death row. It also meant she would testify for the state. Deb Sheldon, who Joe said he didn't even know, had already pled guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree murder. She told authorities she saw Joe beat and rape her great-aunt Helen. Her bargain reduced her possible punishment from death to a maximum of 10 years in prison. James Dean was next. He'd initially denied any involvement, but a failed polygraph test got him talking. He said he was with a group of people who broke into the apartment and attacked Helen. Richard asked him what caused his 180-degree switch, and James said he'd remembered his involvement through a dream. From the memories he thought he saw in his dreams, James would give authorities 5 more statements, overall telling 9 different accounts since his arrest. Burt used at least 6 of them for the case. The new versions began discussions between James's lawyer and the county attorney for a plea bargain. That bargain was solidified when Burt showed James the crime video. When James saw Helen's lifeless body, he buried his head in his lawyer's coat and sobbed, and said he was ready to plead guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree murder. His plea gave total cooperation to the state of Nebraska regarding the homicide of Helen Wilson, and reduced his possible punishment from death to 10 years. James and Deb both said that much of their statements about the murder came from what they'd seen in their dreams. James estimated 90% of his memories were revealed to him as he slept. And their statements were devastating for Joe. They said a group of 6, Joe, Joanne, Deb, James, Tom Winslow, and Kathy Gonzalez, had broken into the small apartment with a plan to rob the woman. Joe and Tom took turns raping Helen, while Joanne held her down and put a pillow over her face. In a pre-trial deposition, Joe's lawyer asked James if there was anything he remembered from actually being at the crime scene. James responded with this, quote, "Oh, well, when you dream about something that you did, you're actually there." He also said the crime scene video helped jog his memory. He mentioned conversations with his attorney where they developed a scenario for what had happened in the apartment. James's ability to recall supposed details from a 4-year-old crime, but then be unable to keep straight what he'd told authorities the day before, left the other defense lawyers skeptical. The defense also learned how Bert had been helpful to James in recalling that night. Bert had shown him a piece of paper with the names of his co-defendants to confirm where they'd been sitting in the car as they drove to the victim's apartment. Then, when he was asked to physically describe Joseph White, the man James claimed he saw rape Helen Wilson, James said he could not. He said, quote, "I wouldn't know him if I seen him." Kathy Gonzalez followed suit by pleading no contest to aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Joe got his own shot at a deal on September 28th when the prosecutor offered him second-degree murder and 25 years to life. He refused. The state had 4 potential witnesses against Joseph White, and he called them all liars. All he had was his hope that a jury would agree. On October 30th, 1989, the 26-year-old Joseph White walked into the Jefferson County courtroom. The curious and connected filled many of the 195 seats, and nearly 24 of Helen Wilson's relatives listened as Gage County Attorney Richard Smith's baritone voice filled the room. He had flat-out confessions and guilty pleas from 3 people charged in the 68-year-old widow's rape and murder. And he had a no-contest plea from a 4th. 3 of them were ready to place their hands on the Bible and send Joe to prison for life, or worse. Tony Redman, Joe's attorney, knew the state's witnesses were both a strength and a weakness for the prosecution. He knew he needed to cast doubt on them, and he asked the jurors to consider the credibility of Joanne, James, and Deb. He pointed out Joanne had said she was so high she saw paint bleeding down the walls of Helen's apartment. She also gave investigators several versions of the story. And James and Deb, they were only testifying to memories they had recovered through dreams. Richard stood up for his witnesses and admitted the inconsistencies. But he drove home one point. All 3 would say that Joseph White was there and that he had raped Helen Wilson. And after all, he said, quote, "If you were there and observed that, who wouldn't dream?" Here's the story Deb Sheldon told about the night her great-aunt was murdered. It all started in a bathroom. On February 5th, 1985, Joanne and James met to talk in the bathroom of a friend's apartment. Then she joined them to go riding with Tom Winslow and Joseph White, who they knew as Lobo. They ended up at Helen Wilson's apartment. Her great-aunt recognized Deb and said hello. Then Joanne and Joe started shoving the woman around, elbowing Deb when she tried to stop them. They knocked Deb into a wall so hard her head was bleeding and she passed out. When Deb gained consciousness, she said her great-aunt was on the living room floor, her hands bound behind her back. Joanne knelt near the woman's head and held a pillow over her face. Tom held her feet and Joe straddled her as she struggled and screamed. When Joe was finished raping the 68-year-old widow, Tom rolled her over and took his turn. Deb said her great-aunt didn't move anymore after that. Joe's lawyer, Tony Redman, came out swinging. Deb acknowledged she'd only met Joe once, on the night of the murder, and she admitted she'd told Tony that she didn't know what Joe White looked like. Tony asked her what had caused her to change her testimony so many times before the trial, and she said, quote, "Nothing. I just did it." Tony then focused on Dr. Wayne Price's role. Deb admitted the part-time deputy and her own counselor had helped her remember the memories through dreams, after she'd initially recalled nothing. She told Tony her dreams and the facts she remembered from that night were identical. James Dean was next on the stand. He'd given authorities 9 different statements after his arrest. He testified he'd seen Joe, Joanne, Tom, and Deb in Helen's apartment. He said he remembered freezing when he heard the widow's bones break. He vividly described the rapes. And he gave Joanne a more active role than just covering Helen's face. He said she was holding the hands and licking Helen's upper body. Back in Tom's car, James said Joe and Joanne talked about what had happened, and they said that it would be fun to do it again. Tony responded to James's testimony by focusing on an earlier conversation they'd had about Joseph White, one where James had said he wouldn't know Joe if he saw him. After James, Joanne took the stand. She admitted she'd held a pillow on Helen Wilson's face because she didn't want the widow to see the face that would haunt her. She said she knew from previous experience that when you're raped, the rapist's face can haunt you. She offered no explanation for the need to cover the widow's face, which was already wrapped tightly with an Afghan. But her testimony tied Joe to a piece of physical evidence. She said he performed a trick that ended with torn money, just like the torn $5 bill found on the floor of Helen's apartment and entered as Exhibit 19 in Joe's trial for first-degree murder. For damage control, Tony had her detail her personality disorder and how it had led to memory problems. She also told the court how she talked telepathically from her cell with her fiancé in another state, and she described her vision of a woman dressed in Victorian clothing. Then Tony asked Joanne about her vastly different accounts of Helen's death and how she'd come to the version that more closely matched the crime scene. They went back and forth, with Tony asking her about the police officer's role in her story. At first she said they didn't feed her any information, but then admitted the information they gave her was influential in helping her sort out her memories. And by the end, she said she would not have been able to remember anything without the officer's information. When Joe took the stand to deny any role in the crime, he said he'd never done a trick with a $5 bill and he'd never even met Deb Sheldon. But his answer to a single question may have determined where he'd spend the next 2 decades. The prosecutor showed the church portrait Helen had given to her children and grandchildren for Christmas right before she was killed. Richard asked him to tell him what it was. Joe answered with what he saw. "It's a picture of an old woman," he said. The defense lawyers winced. They'd never thought to prepare him for that moment. Later, Tony said his client's answer was honest. To him, that's what the picture was. But after the trial's drama, Joe's answer only increased perception that he was a cold-blooded killer. Before handing the case to the jury, Judge Rist asked the jury to consider the motives behind the eyewitness testimonies. Their maximum sentences had started with capital punishment, but Deb and James had signed deals that would likely result in sentences of 10 years and actual time of half that long. Prosecutors had reduced the charge against Joanne from first to second-degree murder, and they recommended 15 years of prison time for her. The jury began their deliberations at 11:40 a.m. on Thursday, November 9th. They came back 4 hours later. Guilty. Helen Wilson's family had endured the entire 2-week trial and more than 4 years of wondering since their mother's and grandmother's death. When asked if the verdict offered relief, Helen's son Daryl pumped his fist in the air. At his sentencing 2 months later, Joe's insistence that he was innocent was met with a life behind bars. Kathy Gonzalez got 10 years, along with James Dean and Deborah Sheldon. Joanne Taylor had been recommended a 15-year sentence by the prosecution, but the judge believed that she had likely killed Helen Wilson when she said she placed the pillow over her face. The judge gave her 40 years in prison. Finally, Tom Winslow got 50 for aiding and abetting second-degree murder.
We need to take a quick break, so don't go too far.
But back to 1989. The Beatrice Six had received their sentences for the murder and rape of the 68-year-old widow. Kathy Gonzalez, Deborah Sheldon, and James Dean had reduced their punishments from the possibility of death to just 10 years, and Joanne Taylor's plea got her 40 years. Thomas Winslow received 50, and Joseph White would be jailed for life. At his sentencing, Joseph vowed to spend his prison time fighting his conviction. He said this, quote, "I am not guilty of this crime. I have never been guilty of this crime, and even if the sentencing is getting out due to parole, then I will take that opportunity to prove my innocence." The sheriff promoted Bert Searcy to lieutenant and put him in charge of investigations and road troops. Helen Wilson's family considered him a hero, and to honor him, they donated $3,000 to the sheriff's office for new firearms. Groups throughout Beatrice recognized Bert for a job well done. The Lincoln Journal-Star published a Sunday profile with the headline, "Investigators' Tenacity Key to Solving Beatrice Murder." But a semen sample, recovered from Helen's apartment and stored in the police department's basement for 20 years, would prove that he didn't. Before his conviction, Joe White thought one thing could prove him innocent of the 1985 rape and murder of Helen Wilson. He stood before the judge in January 1990 to ask for DNA tests. He knew they would show he wasn't in the Beatrice widow's apartment, but DNA testing was still new to the courts in 1990. Joe hoped the results could be used to exclude him as a suspect. But Gage County attorney Richard Smith held that he had the gold standard to prove Joe's guilt: the jury verdict. After all, the criminal justice system is built on the righteousness of 12 people who hear evidence and weigh it to deliver a just decision. Richard had that on his side as he argued that the FBI wouldn't use the new DNA technology on evidence obtained before 1988. He said whatever biological samples were collected from Wilson's apartment in 1985 had surely degraded beyond use by the passage of time. So Judge William Rist denied Joe's request and sent him to the Nebraska State Penitentiary. He threw himself into prison jobs. His first job as a janitor earned him just $1.21 a day. Then he moved to the wood shop, where he earned 38 cents an hour. After 7 years, he'd earned enough money to hire an attorney. The first lawyer took the case nowhere. The second, fresh out of law school, did a lot of work, but it never culminated in an appeal. Then, in 2001, the Nebraska DNA Testing Act took effect. This new law, pioneered by Nebraska State Senator Ernie Chambers, allowed people convicted of felonies to file motions for DNA tests if the technology was unavailable at the time of their convictions. Joe began working with an attorney to obtain that DNA testing. The lawyer interviewed some of Joe's co-defendants and realized Thomas Winslow could also be redeemed by DNA tests. So in October 2005, Joe and Tom filed motions for crime scene evidence testing. Their lawyers obtained court orders to protect the material so that they didn't suddenly vanish from the police station's basement, where they had been secured for 20 years in the evidence vault. Richard Smith fought against the motions, and he said Tom had forfeited the right to challenge his convictions because he'd pleaded guilty. On August 28, 2006, a district judge denied both requests. The judge said a favorable result for Tom or Joe would only suggest that one of the men didn't rape Helen. They still could have participated in the crime in other ways, according to the judge. Joe and Tom and their attorneys appealed to the Nebraska Supreme Court. On November 2nd, 2007, more than 22 years after Helen Wilson was murdered, the state's highest court ruled in their favor. The justices decided DNA testing might exclude both Joe and Tom as sources of the semen. Such a result would have caused jurors at Joe's trial to seriously doubt the testimonies from Joanne Taylor, James Dean, and Deb Sheldon. Run the DNA tests, the Supreme Court said. Nearly 18 years after his arrest, Joseph White had won a significant court ruling. In 2008, the Human DNA Identification Laboratory at the University of Nebraska Medical Center tested the blood and semen samples recovered from the apartment and saved in the Beatrice Police Department. 2 cuttings from Helen Wilson's nightgown, 2 slides and a cutting from the carpet, a slide of fluid taken from inside the victim. They also tested blood from Joe, Tom, and Helen. The tests excluded Joe and Tom. On August 1st, their lawyers announced what they called the first DNA exoneration in Nebraska. Joe and Tom were still in prison, even as DNA testing proved they were not in Helen's apartment that night. Their attorneys filed motions to vacate their convictions, but nothing moves quickly in the legal system. Joanne was also still in prison. Deb, James, and Kathy had been released after serving 5 of their 10 years. Randy Ritnour now controlled the rest of the case. He had defeated Richard Smith for Gage County attorney in 2006. He sought help from Nebraska Attorney General John Bruning, who assigned 2 state attorneys to the case. The team thought it was setting out to re-convict the Beatrice Six when it realized much of the preserved evidence had not been tested. But the tests on the remaining 40 biological samples from the crime scene also cleared Joe and Tom. None of the semen, blood, or pubic hairs found on or near the body could be linked to the men. What's more, none of the crime scene DNA matched Joanne, James, Deb, or Kathy. It belonged solely to Helen Wilson and an unidentified male. A judge ordered a new trial for Joe and released him on his own authority. Joe White walked out of prison a free man on October 15th, 2008, and checked into a Lincoln motel to take a bath and sleep in a real bed. 2 days later, Tom Winslow walked free, and authorities quickly assembled a state and local task force to try and find the man responsible for the DNA. They set up a war room in the Beatrice Police Department, where they covered the walls with crime scene photos. They stacked up 11 volumes of police reports, 5 volumes of trial transcripts, and 6 files full of court documents. With their modern technology, the investigators tracked the rapist's DNA through state and federal databases and struck out for a match. They turned to a list of early suspects and they saw one possibility that intrigued them. His blood type matched the killer's. His name was Bruce Allen Smith. Remember, Beatrice police considered Bruce a strong suspect in 1985 until a blood test eliminated him. But they'd preserved the saliva, hair, and blood samples Bruce gave back then, so a DNA comparison could be made. The lab analyst selected the root of Bruce's pubic hair to obtain the genetic markers. They matched exactly. It was his blood and semen in Helen Wilson's apartment. The blood on the wall that Deb Sheldon claimed she'd left from her head wound, it was Bruce Smith's. If anyone else was involved, Corey O'Brien, an assistant attorney general and one of the leading members of the task force, said they miraculously left no DNA behind. The team started the hunt for Bruce, and they couldn't wait to see the look on his face when they arrested him for a 23-year-old murder. They found him in an Oklahoma City cemetery. He had died of AIDS in 1992. The task force had aimed to reconvict the Six by examining the investigation and evidence, but the discovery of Bruce Allen Smith shocked them into a different direction. Gage County attorney Randy Ritnour said they couldn't understand how 6 people could have just given up their liberty and not been involved, but a conversation with Bert Searcy gave their confessions a new light. Even with the DNA tests, Burt thought Joseph White and the others raped and killed Helen Wilson. He also thought Joe was guilty of 3 attempted rapes of elderly Beatrice women that occurred in 1983. But Joe had still been in the Army, stationed at Fort Hood, Texas in 1983. The task force was stunned. How could the man who had solved the Helen Wilson case not know something so critical about the main suspect? Once the team started looking at the possibility that Burt had arrested the wrong people, the deputies' investigation began to unravel. They looked at the crime scene photos and saw that Helen's apartment exhibited every hallmark of a sex crime, not a robbery. The original police investigators had also thought it was a sexually motivated killing. At Joe's trial, 2 witnesses testified the Six had searched the apartment for cash, but the investigators saw no signs of ransacking. And remember that $1,300 in cash sat in Helen's purse in plain sight. How had a group of criminals, living on the edge, not bothered to look in the widow's purse? In addition, investigators on the task force had never known rape to be a spectator crime. None could think of a sex assault where the rapist took women along to watch. And the more they dug, the more the new investigators doubted the convictions. They discovered the deep rift that existed between the police and sheriff's departments over Helen's murder. Remember how when Burt got his badge back, the police chief declined to develop his leads because he believed the deputy had the wrong people? The new team also learned some police investigators never bought Burt's theory of the Six. But when they would voice their concerns, they were told things like, "You're trying to prove these people not guilty, stay out of it." The task force also saw how investigators took this attitude of presumed guilt into the 1989 interrogations, too. The surviving tapes revealed multiple examples of leading questions posed by Burt and Beatrice Police Sergeant Sam Stevens. The 2 also mentioned confidential crime scene details that helped the witnesses seem even more credible. A couple of times, the suspects changed their stories or produced more accurate details after breaks in the tape. Task force members were troubled by the recording breaks, and they wondered what sort of techniques Sam and Burt were using while the camera was off. Burt and Sam also showed witnesses crime scene videos and photos and drove them to Helen's apartment building to help them jog their memory. Dr. Wayne Price's role was another unorthodox and concerning practice. The sheriff's psychologist helped witnesses recover so-called repressed memories through their dreams. It is typical for forensic psychologists to observe investigations from afar to determine if a suspect is mentally competent, but it's almost unheard of for them to assume the role of a therapist for the suspect. Corey O'Brien, the assistant attorney general, called the dual roles mind-boggling and said he'd never heard of it happening before. The new investigative team also found records that showed some of the defense attorneys had a hand in recovering their clients' memories. For example, attorneys for James and Joanne gave their clients statements written by their other co-defendants. With all of these tactics, leading questions, interrogation tape breaks, a deputy therapist, crime scene footage, and statements from other defendants, the task force saw how Joanne Taylor, James Dean, and Deb Sheldon could have essentially told the same story on the witness stand. Task force members also talked to one other person from the original investigation, Lisa Brown, or confidential informant number 1. Remember that Lisa told Burt that she and Joanne had talked at 7:30 a.m. on February 6, 1985, as they watched police gather outside Helen Wilson's apartment building. There, Joanne had bragged to her that she'd killed the old woman the night before. Lisa told the task force members essentially the same story in 2008, but this time, the authorities noticed a discrepancy in her account. The timing was wrong. Helen Wilson's brother-in-law didn't dial 911 until 9:29 a.m. on February 6th. Police cars would not have arrived until Lisa's school day was well underway. They were also interested by what Lisa could not remember in 2008. More than 20 years after giving her statement, she said Joanne didn't mention an accomplice, whereas in the past, she'd maintained that Joanne had implicated Joseph White. The investigators asked Brown to take a polygraph test, but she refused. She said no even when they sent Burt with the request. They'd hoped that he might have some influence with his former confidential informant who'd founded his investigation, but she refused him to. When task force members interviewed the suspects in the Beatrice Six, Joanne and James admitted that they'd lied in 1989 to cut deals with the state. Both gave polygraphs to show the task force that they were telling the truth this time. Only Deb Sheldon stood behind her trial testimony. She remained convinced that the Six had killed her great-aunt. On November 14, 2008, Attorney General John Bruning called a meeting of the task force. He listened to reports about the original investigation and about the man identified by DNA. He asked, "Is there anybody here who has any doubts that this guy is the sole killer?" There were no doubts. That afternoon, John called a news conference to announce that DNA tests had identified Bruce Allen Smith as the lone rapist and killer of Helen Wilson. The same tests, paired with a new investigation, exonerated the 6 people who'd served a combined 70 years in prison for the crime. John placed the blame on Richard Smith and, to a lesser degree, investigators.
So the 6 convicted in 1989 were exonerated thanks to DNA evidence in 2008. Gage County was found liable for the wrongful convictions. After much back and forth in the courts and appeals, the Supreme Court upheld $28.1 million in damages due to the wrongfully convicted. The judgment came as a result of a civil rights lawsuit that Joe White filed back in 2009. In March of 2023, Gage County completed its payoff to the Beatrice Six or their estates, and that total ballooned to a cost of around $30 million for the county, with the addition of attorney's fees. This concludes late edition Crime Beat Chronicles abridged re-release of Lincoln Journal Star's Presumed Guilty podcast. I'm Nat Cardona, signing off for now, but we'll be back so soon with our own original true crime coverage from our newsrooms across the country. See you then.